we're getting some sense on Sunday from Benedict Spence this morning. Benedict, we've been talking about Afghanistan and the deal that was done for the essentially the US troops to be able to withdraw, and the Taliban holding back until they did. There will inevitably be some people in the States who will say, well, this is actually precisely what we should be doing. This stuff isn't our problem. There will be some people in the UK saying that as well. You know, why, when you look at the hangover from Iraq, when you look at the hangover of our interference in some of the other areas, other nations in that area, there are going to be some people saying, you know, it might be bad, it might look bad, we might be abandoning these people, but it is about time we stopped interfering in some of these nations. What would you say to them?
Always, when people say, I mean, with Iraq, it's a slightly different question, but when it comes to Afghanistan, people are saying, well, we shouldn't have been there in the first place. Okay, so you're happy to just allow the country to be in the hands of these people, but also to be a haven for organizations like Al-Qaeda to launch attacks, not just against Western nations, actually. You know, Al-Qaeda conducted operations all over the world. You know, I think people forget this because it was, 20 odd years ago. Actually, they, bombed African countries. They bombed a lot of Middle Eastern countries. This was not just, a jihad against America in the grand scheme of things. And I don't think there is a morally upstanding argument for saying that you should just allow countries in this situation to continue. The difficulty, of course, is if you are going to go into a country like Afghanistan, you have to commit to it. You do have to commit for more than, I'm afraid, just one or two generations. A lot of people say that doesn't always work. A lot of people in the sort of the Labour anti-imperialist movement, for example, say that doesn't work. But that's not true. And we've seen that with Germany, we've seen that with Italy, we've seen that with
Lauren
Japan.
McKevitt reminded us earlier, and I hadn't even considered this really, but she was right in saying, as are you, Americans still are in Germany.
There's still 40,000 American personnel in Germany. It's the idea that that these occupations to stem the tide of, I suppose you call it extremist government, don't work. It's just not true. It depends on how committed you are, ultimately.
And how do you think all of this, bearing in mind that now there are reports of 250,000 people being displaced, there are reports of people whom actually helped the Western forces essentially being abandoned as well, who will not want to stay in that country. How do you think this will influence the narrative around the refugee migrant debate? I mean, we saw, I think, in the last 24 hours, something like between 500 and 600 again entering British shores. And I mean, look, I think there's an absolute valid argument for people to say that this shouldn't be happening. Criminal gangs are profiting from it. We don't know who every single person is that comes. And clearly, by this happening, not only does it make the whole debate quite toxic, but potentially we're not helping people who really need it in refugee camps. So all of that is valid stuff. But surely it's going to reframe the debate somewhat from people being able to criticise this.
Well, this is where it gets really tricky when people say, well, this isn't our problem, we shouldn't be there anyway. What are you going to do about and it will be hundreds of thousands of refugees. Western countries, a lot of Western countries actually can't take hundreds of thousands of extra people as refugees. And it's not just going to be from Afghanistan. You will continue to see refugees from the Horn of Africa, from the conflict in Ethiopia, which is just not being talked about. We're pretending that that's not happening. From Nigeria, every year, we again pretend that that's not happening. And they continue to come from the Middle East. It is going to be an additional hundreds of thousands every year that Afghanistan now contributes, if not millions. Western countries can't actually just take all of these people in. So what are you going to do with them? You're just going to leave them there? That actually is a large part of the idea of what we were doing there, was providing a form of stable existence for a lot of these people, because most of them don't actually want to flee the land that they and their ancestors have always lived in. They don't want to flee their way of life. That's not what most people want. But ultimately, American, Western, NATO troops being there allowed a sort of a sense of stability to sort of persevere, and it allowed people to go on living their lives. And that happened after we entered Afghanistan in 2001 and sort of upset the whole thing. And it wasn't, the Taliban were not great, but that is certainly, we set fire to the hornet's nest, and now we're leaving.
But
so
we also, actually, sorry, go on, finish your point, Benedict.
No, the Western nations can't have their cake and eat it. They can't say, well, we've got absolutely no business being in Afghanistan, and these Afghans who we've abandoned have no business seeking help from us.
Also, the timing. I mean, it's practically 20 years to the day.
Well, you have got the very real possibility that on 9/11, that the Taliban's flag will be flying over Kabul again. Yeah, and it's
It may be well
ultimately,
before then, but yes.
well, yes, but that I think is, Joe Biden wanted it to be the symbolic date that they'd be out by that day, and you just kind of thought in the back of your mind, is that really the best idea? Are you not tempting fate ever so slightly? And we can talk about Trump till the cows come home. We all knew what he was. We all knew what he wanted. But when Joe Biden said the adults are back in charge, that it was going to be a complete sea change. We were expecting far more sensible, far more humane foreign policy than we got under the Trump administration. This is inhumane. This is craven. And I think I've never seen or heard of a U.S. administration shredding its international credibility quite as quickly as the Biden administration has.
Why?
I mean, I think that they think domestically it's very popular, and there's no question that certainly amongst the sort of the Rust Belt Trump voters, actually, no other way of saying it, it is very popular. Trump was elected on the back of saying, enough to these forever wars, let's bring our boys home. And, to a lot of people, that does resonate, especially people in that sort of, sort of lower middle class American existence where there's the huge opioid epidemic, there's a lot of poverty growing, and, lots of people know people or are related to people who have served in Iraq or Afghanistan. A lot of people know people who died in those conflicts. So you can see why that resonated. And Biden's whole appeal was being able to reach back across the divide and bring those people back into what was traditionally their fold. So you can see why that makes a lot of sense. But this is the other thing, and this is why you see a very weak response from the Labour Party in this country. There is the whole sort of the very, I hate the expression woke, but it's the best way of explaining it, the anti-imperialist sort of tendency on the British and American lefts, which say that no intervention is a good intervention. Well, what can these people say right now? And these are the people who are essentially running now Biden's party. What can they say to the suffering? They can't say, put the troops back in, because they're anti-imperialists. They're anti-American interventionism. So they find themselves in a bit of a catch-22 situation. Damned if they do, and hypocrites if they don't.
And ultimately as well, are we, which is a big question, going to be safer as a result of this? I mean, if we went into that country because of the fact that, and again, let's go back to 2001, we were all sold the war on terror. This was what this was about. We had to go into Afghanistan. They were breeding all of these awful extremists, all of these criminals. That's why 9/11 happened. War on terror. And, well, if we've not won that war, or at least provided some sort of stability, well, then surely the world is not a safer place than it was in 2001.
It's not going to make us safe. You're going to see a generation of young Afghan, especially men, particularly men, being radicalised entirely.
But actually, sorry to say, on both sides, and what they've actually managed to do as well is that there were people on the side of the Taliban who hated the West already, and then there's going to be another group of people now who almost like invested in what the West sold them as this could be stability, and now the West will say, well, actually, see you later. So they're going to hate the West as well.
Well, as I said at the top of this discussion, that's why there's no sign of what was once called the Northern Alliance. The coalition's allies in Afghanistan in fighting the Taliban, they've just disappeared. They have nothing to fight for, nothing that they want to fight for, because the idea that they were sold hasn't been held up. And the problem is, of course, it's not just about terrorism, because we can talk all day about the Islamist extremists that will find a home in Afghanistan. It's also the countries around Afghanistan that are going to now, they're going to enter the vacuum. That's Iran, that's Pakistan, that's China. China has already started negotiations with the Taliban. They're no fools on this. We all know Pakistan's affiliation with the Taliban. And Iran, of course, America's great enemy in the region. They will waste no time in actually getting involved in this nation on their border, as they've done in Lebanon, as they've done in Yemen, Syria, Iraq. It's going to be a familiar pattern. You're going to see it all over again. And no, ultimately, initiated by President Trump, but rammed through by President Biden, this is going to be remembered, I think, as easily the worst foreign policy disaster since Vietnam.